So here we are. We're already welcoming back people. I already see the goodbye YouTube. Hello YouTube. Exactly. So we just beat the game. We just paused for a very brief amount of time in order to collect some thoughts. So let's talk about Bastion. So I went in not knowing too much about the game other than it would be kind of like an action game. And I had played Hades before, so I see a lot of elements from Hades where I see things where you have swappable weapons, you can do things to increase the challenge of the areas themselves by putting idols in a shrine. Unlike Hades, you kind of build, well, I guess kind of like Hades too. You end up building a central location known as the Bastion, and from there, you are basically just looking for shards to finally complete the Bastion, which opens up new shops and or upgrades existing shops, and find people / collect people along the way. The game is very narration heavy, so for people that do not like listening to one person speak for a very long amount of time, this game is not for you. The central narrator is one of the only voice actors in the game, and I feel like even though he did a decent job, it definitely suffered from not having more voice actors. In fact, we only get another voice actor extremely late in the game, but that's spoilers to describe who that is given to. But I do feel like, compared to one of their later titles from the Supergiant games, this one definitely feels more like an indie game versus what I would consider like AAA quality. I think there were some things lacking in the stage design as well as some of the actions, where I don't feel like I'm compelled to replay this game, even though there is a New Game Plus option compared to some of their other offerings like Hades. So I feel like some of my misgivings come into things where things were a little outside player control. So you don't research weapons like in other games or like get components in order to craft them for the first time. You have to find them in the overworld. And a big problem is that you're limited to just 2 weapons at a time. So if you have like a ranged option and a melee weapon, and then you come across a new weapon, which the game wants you to pick up, you don't get to choose which one it eliminates. So sometimes you're left with 2 ranged weapons and they have no synergy, or you have 2 melee weapons where you can't use them at all in different situations because they're basically filling the same slot. So that definitely felt very awkward. They have a mechanic where you can store a certain amount of healing potions to partially recover your health, and if you pick them up while you're already maxed, you heal. I think that mechanic was okay. I was very let down by the super attacks in this game. We tried a handful of them, and they just did not really feel rewarding for the most part. I think there was only one weapon, which was like the column weapon of all things, had a special that was worth using. Everything else just seemed to be low damage, rooted me in place, potentially didn't give me any iframes, and just kind of disappointing. We ended up just using a lot of like place and forget ones, like trip mines. But yeah, they were definitely not impactful in our run whatsoever. If they had removed it from the game, I literally would not have changed almost any outcome or any speed to any of our clears in the game. Now, we didn't unlock all of the specials, so maybe there's better ones, but we did try like 9 or 10, and there was like only one worth using, and that was really late in the game. So, kind of mediocre. The weapons themselves did feel pretty distinct. You have things like hammers, spears, machete, and the way the game wants to encourage you to use these weapons is outside of the story stages, there's essentially like challenge stages, which some of them felt very fair. There's some we definitely first tried and I felt were a little too easy. And then there were others that were just BS, and they required you to learn gimmicks outside the weapon itself. It's like a gimmick about the challenge that really made me not want to go back and redo like 3 or 4 of those challenges. Like, I did not like the shield challenge. I didn't like the machete challenge. I didn't like the tower defense with one of the charge weapons. It felt bad. It felt bad. It's like, is it doable? Oh, I'm sure it is. Was it fun to do without any weapon upgrades? Absolutely not. It felt awful. So it was kind of mixed. I do like the concept that you can unlock a building that gives you challenges to go for, that also gives you more upgrade points, so that way you can upgrade your favorite weapon. or you can use those challenges. Nope, not mid. Let's use a different word. You could go for, I guess, trophy achievements. We'll call them achievements. If you go for certain achievements, you'll get rewarded for it, and you can use that in the shop to either buy new component pieces, which are required for upgrades. You can't just upgrade to max. You have to find little pieces of the weapon, sort of, in order to get to another tier of upgrades. I do like that when you do spend your points to upgrade, I like that you can switch between one of two things all the way through. That very much reminds me of the mirror concept from Hades, where you had like one side of the mirror and then the other side of the mirror. So I feel like I can see a lot of remnants of what ends up being in Hades in there, including some of the attacks themselves with the sword and other things like that. But I think it's lacking some of the polish that we've seen in the later games. So I know, for example, dodge roll felt pretty bad to use most of the time. I'm not convinced it had any iframes through the entirety of the game, which is not a good feeling for a dodge roll. It does make you move faster, so there's still a purpose of using it. But then they add a gimmick at the very end of the game that makes it more of like a jump rather than a roll. So then it's not even useful to just like tumble into an attack. So you can't do the same attack cancels that some of the weapons had. So that felt terrible. And I think like a big detriment to the game, without going into big spoilers, is there are a lot of gimmick stages. And a lot of them were just not really fun gimmicks. Like, imagine playing like with all ranged weapons where you need to be able to see where you're aiming, and you can't do that for the most part unless they're very close to you. Then it'll give you kind of like an auto aim with the controller. So imagine that, where you need to figure out your exact facing and exact position, and then the game is like, you know, it'd be a great area to play in. How about a forest where the foliage blocks 90% of your character model at all times? And I'm like, why? Like, why though? Why have stages like this? Or they're like, you know what we're gonna do when you've gone through the entire game and you're just looking to basically beat the game? Why don't we make an entire platforming stage where you're not fighting any enemies and you're just jumping for like 2.5, 3 minutes? Does it add anything to the game? Absolutely not. Is it worth adding? Absolutely not. Does it make the game worse for having it? Absolutely. There's also, for how short the game is, which, you know, given we didn't 100% it, we beat it in 2 sessions. So we could not have been playing for more than 7 hours total. And that includes doing a majority of the challenges. So it's not like we just did only plot. Like, we did at least one try of every challenge for every weapon. And we still beat it in like 7 hours or less, while also going through all the optional dialogue, etc., etc. So it's not a very long game. But I do feel like some of the stages really stretched it out. Like, there were, I think, was it 2 or 3 auto-scroller levels, chat? Like, why? Why have auto-scrollers? Why was there more than one auto-scroller? There's so many questions. I think this game does also suffer from the rule of cool, where it does want to show you like this brand new shiny thing, but the way the game is kind of built and structured is that you take an existing weapon, upgrade it, and then it's like fun or good to use. But then it gives you the weapon in its base form, and it's like the new weapons just tend to not be as good as some of the starting weapons. And so if you end up upgrading those starter weapons, the new weapons just feel atrocious. Like, we had things that like shot fire, which sounds cool until you realize that it makes you move really slow. You have to wait a long time for it to regenerate. And you're fighting enemies that zip super quickly throughout the area, or they snipe you. And the weapon can't hit either of those targets well. So I'm like, why? Why not introduce this at the beginning of the game when you have slower enemies? I don't understand. Or things like, we kept ending up getting replacements for bow, and honestly, most of the weapons were just completely inferior to bow. The bow just did so much more damage, and the fact that it even gets like stunned later in the game, it's like, why even bother with some of these weapons? Also, machete was terrible. Machete was terrible. That was also, that was a challenge. There were several, not just that one, but there were several challenge mode only weapons where I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna upgrade once before we beat the game. I'll try the challenge once, and if we don't win, I don't care, because I'm not using this to beat the game under any scenario. So I guess we'll talk about some of the positive points, as I feel like I'm definitely being very critical at the moment. I think the music is definitely the strong point of the game itself. We're looping the main menu music at the moment, but there are some really good songs, I think, throughout that get you into the game itself. I do think it's fairly simple to pick up. I did like the kind of parry mechanic with the shield. We didn't use it too much, but I can see that being a lot of fun, potentially. As I said before, I think the narrator did a decent job. I just wish there were more voice actors and actresses in general. I guess it should be more broad. I guess for what it is, like, if I were to put a price on it, I would never pay more than, I think, $12 for the game. It's not long enough to really justify paying anywhere near, like, a full-price game. And I think that's where it is. Like, would I pay $9.99 for it? Probably. If I was really into the game, I could do Game Plus, and I could easily get, like, my dollars to hours value. But it's kind of a hard sell for anything close to, like, what would be a traditional full retail price. As I said before, this feels more like an actual indie game, where it's definitely shorter duration, hard focus on the mechanics, I would say, or just the short-lived story. But it doesn't offer, like, the best replay value ever. Unless you're just looking for challenge, then there's things you can pump the challenge. But there's not really, like, an incentive to New Game Plus. We're not going to see really that much more. I guess we had kind of like a pick a path later on in the story. I guess if you wanted to see those other choices. I don't think they really changed too much, I would guess. Other than maybe the final choice of the game. But... oh well, we'll never know, because I'm not going to go back and play it again. But I do feel like one thing that could have been adjusted a bit more was the whole gimmick of Bastion itself, which I did not really describe, but I'll capture it here before we go into spoiler territory. So at the very beginning of the game, it introduces that there's a calamity occurring. Like, literally, as soon as your character is able to move, it tells you this. And so as you walk around leaving the starting room itself, you see the level kind of form as you walk. So you literally see like a path forming, you see like some background things appear as you go through. And I liked the idea of it, but I'm going to be honest with you, it got very disorienting at several points. In particular, there was a stage where you just walk forward like 10 steps, then it would zip you to another part of the stage as the narrator continues. Then you walk forward another 10 steps, and then teleports you completely somewhere else. There were some very questionable choices, I will say, with the stage design, and I want to add emphasis to it, where I liked the idea, it looked cool, but functionally it provided a lot of visual clutter and disinformation, and it was sometimes kind of hard to tell like what was solid and what wasn't solid. So for example, in this kind of pop-up terrain, sometimes like little bits of rubble appeared on the floor, and sometimes you can walk through it, it's just part of the floor, and then other times it's a solid object. So you're trying to like tumble to quickly go through, and you hit it and you bounce off of it, and then you fall off the level and take damage. That was not the best feeling. So there was definitely several moments where we almost soft locked due to the weird pathing choices and switches to open up walls or close walls. So again, I want to emphasize the level design is very, very, very suspect. And I think that also kind of leads to why I would probably not replay it. There wasn't really a level where I was like, wow, that was really cool. I was more like, wow, that's really annoying. Just like, I felt like I said that a lot in particular in the last session, so I do apologize if it sounded like complaining. But honestly, I do think the level design needed a big touch up. So it emphasized a lot of like narrow corridors in more than 50% of the maps, but they also introduced a lot of enemies that would abuse the fact that you couldn't reach them, like literally like sentry guns out of range as you tried going through a zigzag path, or it'll be an enemy that can't take damage from the front and you have to hit it from the rear, but the path is only like 4 characters wide. So if you tumble from anywhere not the center of the path, you're probably gonna fall off because you can't really curve your roll. You just get a dedicated line once you tumble. And that didn't feel good. That didn't feel good, chat. Sometimes you walk through the floor, exactly. There are several points where it's very obvious where the gap is, and it's like, okay, if it's a 2-tile wide gap, you fall in it, right? That makes sense. Sometimes there's a tile wide gap, and most of the time you don't fall through it. So if the enemy like breaks the floor with like a powerful smash, you can walk over it and nothing happens. And then other times you're walking up a solid staircase, except oops, you were like a pixel slightly to the left, even though 3/4 of your character model or more were on the staircase, and you clip through the stairs and take damage. So there's definitely some jank with the level design, even for where it purposely punishes you for tumbling off the edge. There are times where we were 100% definitely in the middle of a floor, going towards more floor without doing like a weird curve or trying to do anything crazy with the movement, and we just clipped through the floor. There's a couple times we got hit by the enemies, and we slid backwards, hitting stairs in particular, and that caused us to clip through the floor and take extra damage. That felt pretty unfair. And I think what I'm going to also say about the enemies is that it lacks some of the visual clarity that is really needed for a game with this high enemy count. So sometimes you can have upwards of like 10, 15, 20 enemies, especially if you're in a challenge mode. And when you go through like this arena style where you have to clear waves of enemies in order to progress like a mini narrative as like a mini game and get more experience and also other things like that, I feel like the enemies really lacked like a summoning animation. So like in something like Hades, whenever an enemy comes in, it gets like a little summoning circle. It has a very distinct animation that acts as its timer. It has a sound effect cue, so you know when it's about to pop and the enemy is able to act. Then there's a brief period of waiting, usually, unless you're point blank with them, and then they move. In this game, they just kind of poof into existence. There's a couple of exceptions, like for example, if they spawn in a box, it's generally pretty fair, or some of the turrets sometimes have an animation when they spawn. But this game is very trigger happy in the sense that if an enemy is even vaguely on screen, even by a pixel, or even not on screen, we've been shot by projectiles before we even can visually register the enemy is there, which was pretty annoying, I will state. So like in particular in the arena battles, I remember distinctly, I was looking for the enemy and I couldn't find him because they put a dark gray enemy against the black background, and it didn't have a spawn animation because it spawned when it wasn't on screen, and it gave no sound cue that it spawned. So I was looking around the arena and then just got shot by what I thought was a wall. And that happened a couple of times where, you know, we kill like all these little mini enemies, and then suddenly, without any animation at all, I don't know why it happens or if it's a bug, but an enemy like as big as like your fist on the screen just exists in a frame and it's attacking already. And that happened many, many times throughout. And some of those enemies have a bit of a wind up, so at least you can react to the hit. Other times it's like, oh no, it's actually been charging up the frame it was alive. It is now hitting you with a slide attack or some nonsense, and that felt pretty bad. So I do feel like there are things I wish they would have touched up, especially if they're going to go back and potentially you know, in this modern era of updating the game, I would have liked to have seen those things. They don't even have to necessarily change like the spawns or the spawn patterns, but man oh man, did it feel like we were taking lots of cheap hits throughout the game. Now, I briefly mentioned getting experience, and I guess it'll be the last part we talk about. So you can essentially get little mini buffs on your character to improve different stats of your character, like crit chance or extra damage or damage resistance or more revives. And I like that mechanic, so every level up you get one additional effect, and that gives you more to look forward to. But yeah, I don't know. We beat the game. We're only like level 5 or 6 out of 10. I don't feel like we needed the other bonuses. I feel like by the time we were level 4, we had everything we basically needed. Everything else was just extreme extras. Like damage resistance plus, you know, picking up healing potions full restores you. Those felt more critical, I would say, to beating the game than some of the other choices for a first-time player. So, I don't know. Definitely mixed. I like the concept that as you pick up the shards, you choose which building to upgrade first. So it is very obvious what you'll be getting and you make those choices. I like those things. But there were several points in the game where it definitely just takes away your choice, like weapons or you know, arbitrarily, like, we're gonna take away both weapon slots. And it felt awkward. It felt very awkward. So I think that's more or less the summarization of the non-spoilers. I will state overall, I would get the game for cheap. It's hard to recommend for anything remotely close to full price. But I do feel like if you've played a game later from this company, the later games are just better. So it's very hard to go from like a Hades to this game. Going from this to Hades, I think would be very good. But yeah, we've seen better from them, unfortunately. So with that, we're going to go into the spoiler portion of the final thoughts. So we'll give people a moment to close out if they need to. But chat, can I just say, that final level was terrible. That final level with the jump gimmick and the column, and then they gave you the column to try to defeat projectilists, but you move really slow and you lose all your other weapons. Why? Why did they do that? It just felt so terrible. I wish, I think her name was Zia. I wish Zia spoke more, because apparently she did have a voice in the game itself, which is odd to me that they just didn't use her for more lines. It would have broken up the narration. And again, it's not that the narration was bad, it's just that you need to mix up who is talking every now and then. And I think they learned that in Hades, that even though there's a lot of dialogue in Hades, it's not just one person giving all the dialogue. Oh, the bazooka. Oh, the bazooka was so bad. I was like, please get this out of my inventory. A non-auto aiming weapon that's supposed to be the final weapon of the game, and it hurts you to use if you're too close on enemies that teleport towards you? What, are they stupid? That's like the exact opposite weapon that you want. You don't want a splash weapon on an enemy that can close the distance in a second. Like, that's the exact wrong weapon to pick with you. You want like a really good melee weapon, or something with like medium range, like a spear to pierce, or the bow, so we stun lock. You don't want the bazooka on a fast moving target. And the fact that most of those weapons locked you in place was absurd. I'm like, how would you realistically use this in a run? Like, half of the time you're trying not to die to like the spin to win enemies or like the fast zipping birds. Like, why the heck would I take a weapon that makes me stand still? Like, actual nonsense. Or like the enemies that have like soft tracking with their rapid fire projectiles. It literally punishes you for standing still. I'm like, why would I want these weapons? That feels so bad. But yeah, I think overall we saw the plot twist coming with the old man like a mile away. We called it in the first session. It didn't really introduce many red herrings other than, I guess, Zulf saying like, oh, I know the true purpose. But we basically sniffed that out. We were not surprised by the ending of the game. I like how the game even acknowledges it doesn't matter whether or not you save him at the end. So it's like, that made me want to play it even less, because your choice doesn't matter. I love the game like basically literally told us that word for word in the narration. That was a choice from them, I guess. But overall, I don't know. It was okay. I think it was worth playing to experience it, and we can appreciate that the company has grown over time. But yeah, I just feel like we could very safely just say Hades did basically everything better. So this was a good starting point for Hades. And by itself, it's not a terrible game. It's a very flawed game. I don't know if it ever has moments where it truly becomes like a brilliant game. It's very interesting from like an art aspect. And again, the music is phenomenal. So that's one thing that carried over to Hades in a good way. But yeah, just a lot of the level design and enemy types, I'm like, yeah, I see like flavors of them in Hades, but they're nowhere near as awful or annoying in Hades. I think they learned a lot of lessons from this game. So that makes me kind of curious about some of the other games they have, like Transistor, I think was the name of the other game. Maybe we'll give it a try, maybe. But I'm gonna go in with slightly lower expectations. I feel like Hades might have been like their their shining achievement, as it were, that really defined them as the company, versus having like a hidden gem. The other ones are more like unpolished, needed to spend a little more time getting laser cut or something to perfect them. Trying to think anything else that would fall into the spoiler topic that would be worth discussing. Talked about the challenges, talked about the enemies, talked about the music, talked about the level design, talked about Bastion. I liked how Bastion changed over time, like when you first find it versus getting the buildings, and then later on when the betrayal happens. I like that the area corrupts. I will say that's probably one of the more interesting points visually speaking. I did like how it changed over time, and it is sad that we lost the pets. Rip the bird, chat. We were so close to saving all of the pets during the invasion, but alas. If only we could do New Game Plus to save the bird this time, chat. Yeah, I don't think there's not a lot to really spoil. I mean, it was a short game, so honestly, I don't have too many other final thoughts. So, chat, if there's anything you want to say as your final thoughts, feel free to spoil. Now would be the time to discuss those things. Otherwise, I am straining to think if there's a topic we have forgotten. Oh, I will say, I was not a fan of melee in general in the game. I do feel like there are abilities you can unlock to make them better. Like, for example, I think the hammer could get stun, but so can the bow. The bow is much better. I think a big problem with it was that when you hit enemies, they didn't really react to you for the most part, which is fine. Not every enemy needs to necessarily react when you strike them. But the lack of hit stun made really fast-moving targets kind of irritating to deal with. Like, why would I use something like a machete that provides no hit stun at all on, like, the giant enemies or, you know, like the slide attack enemies or the teleporters? So I feel like if you're trying to melee, you are forced to use the shield, like, way more than you probably should. So it just ends up taking longer than just pulling out a bow or a musket or the rifle. And yeah, I just didn't see the point of melee for the most part in the game. Do those mechanics. That's not to say every ranged weapon is a gem. Like, I think the Fang Repeater mounting you in place was pretty bad. Pistols, I think, were fine. It takes very long to get them to armor piercing, but I think the armor piece makes that weapon, like, really brilliant, honestly, and it synergizes so well with the other ranged weapons. Some of those melee weapons, I'm like, yeah, I don't see a reason I would ever take this on any of the things we just fought. Maybe it would make more sense on the different challenges where you can't get away with using the bow. Maybe that's what the intent is. But yeah, let's not find out though, chat. We did a little bit of the shrines when we played, so it wasn't like a pure no, we just ignored the mechanic. We did turn it on purpose a couple times, but yeah, not worth it to me. I don't care. Let's read what chat has to say. Not really much to say that hasn't already been said. Game was interesting, but a bit clunky. Could see where it leads to Hades. Narrator was okay, but a bit much and would have helped with other voice actors breaking them up. On stage was a series of unfortunate decisions. Yeah. Oh, those final 3 stages, honestly, where you go from collecting the shards to looking for the allegedly kidnapped Zia, those were bad. Those were easily my least favorite stages outside of the forest stage. And even so, I think the forest stage was right before it, so honestly, those 4 stages in a row were just very tedious. Not a bad game, but not anywhere near as good as Hades. Exactly. It's serviceable, but it's very hard to sell people on it. If you want to do, like, speedruns of the game does seem, like, decent for speedrunning, because, like, again, you choose what you unlock, you could choose challenges. There's not a lot of cutscenes that force you to stop moving. So I could see this game being kind of fun from, like, a pure speedrun standpoint if you're into that kind of thing. I don't know if they have an in-game timer. I didn't look for those things, but I feel like it's fairly fast-paced without being, like, ultra lightning, you know, need to have, like, frame-perfect reflexes for everything. I felt like it was fairly generous. So if you did want a perfect parry to kill a lot of things, it's not super hard to do compared to some other games. And I think that will be my final thought. I'm not interested in the new Game Plus that talks about moving over experience, blah, blah, blah. So I think with that, chat, we're gonna wrap up our final thoughts here. So if you did watch this, I'd like to thank you for watching, and hope to see you again next series.